Okay, we are going to get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of Scrubbing the Skies, the webinar series of the Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy at American University. I'm Wil Burns, and I'm a visiting professor at Northwestern University's Environmental Policy and Culture program and emeritus co-director of the Institute. Now, while I think many people in the climate community recognize the past few years as an inflection point in terms of technological developments in the field and investments by corporate and government sectors, it's far from clear how CDR is being incorporated into the primary long-term international instrument to address climate change, the Paris Agreement, or how this should be facilitated. In this episode, we'll focus on a recent study published in the journal Communications, Earth and Environment that addresses these very issues. Joining me today are two of the authors of this study, Harry Smith and Naomi Vaughan from the School of Environmental Sciences at the University of East Anglia in the United Kingdom. Dr. Smith will initially summarize the finding of the studies, and then we'll proceed to Q&A. So please start entering your questions during the presentation. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Harry, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Will. It's a pleasure to be with you and a pleasure to be part of your webinar series. As Will mentioned, I'm Harry Smith. I'm a PhD researcher here at the University of East Anglia, as the name suggests, based in the East of England in the UK. And our sort of shorthand for our presentation is betting on forests and soils. So this will be an exploration of the way in which CDR fits into the wider context of government plans to decarbonize and reach the challenge of net zero. Now, I recognize as perhaps people come from different areas of climate science and the likes of climate policy. So I always like to start, especially with discussions around CDR, with simply a definition of CDR. You might have heard different terminologies being used. Negative emission technologies is quite a common phrase used in the US. In the UK, where I'm sat currently, it's commonly used as greenhouse gas removal. But at this sort of stage of deployment and discussions, they're more or less interchangeable. So I use the IPCC term of CDR, carbon dioxide removal. Now, CDR is a range of methods that remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And the key element is permanently storing that CO2 in a range of different reservoirs or in specific products. Now, when it comes to the different methods, policymakers tend to speak of two main classifications. The first of which is nature-based removals. These are things such as afforestation, reforestation, improving the way we manage our forests. Similarly, soil carbon sequestration. So we're adding more soil carbon to our commonly agricultural soils. And then similarly, things like coastal wetlands and seagrass meadows, what's a growing category of blue carbon. Contrasted with that often is engineered methods. These are things such as direct air carbon capture and storage, or DACS, using chemicals to scrub CO2 from the atmosphere and store it in geological reservoirs. And similarly, what can be described as a hybrid method, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, or BECCS. Now, what's really key to take away about this group of methods is these are not, although they're two different classifications, not an homogeneous group of methods. They're contrasted in terms of different costs, different side impacts, different co-benefits, and also different potentials and what they can remove on an annual basis, and our ability to actually readily deploy them in the decades to come. So far from being a sort of a range of methods that are interchangeable, these are more characterized by difference. Now, whilst people might be familiar with tree planting or a variety of other methods, perhaps growing recognition of direct air capture, what's lesser known is the role of CDR, particularly within global and national climate governance. So this is a diagram from the IPCC Working Group 3 report, which was just finalized this month, but published last year. And this is essentially for a hypothetical country with a net zero target, and essentially describes three roles CDR has over time. The first of which, prior to reaching a net zero target, is the deployment of CDR helps accelerate the rate of emission reductions in the near term. Now, as a country nears towards a net zero target, the bulk of emissions have been reduced. CDR shifts into being used to balance the sources and sinks that's implicit within the definition of net zero. And that's positive side of the balance tends to be emissions from hard to abate sectors, so things such as fertilizer emissions from agriculture, chemical emissions, certain industry sectors, and also long-range transports. These are areas that there's either issues with cost or issues with technology that make them difficult to decarbonize. So we should balance them out with negative emissions from carbon dioxide removal. Now, the story doesn't stop there for a country. Often there's a need to go net negative. This is where CDR is really key to the overall balance, the emissions balance of the country. This could be for two main reasons. The first of which is perhaps we overshoot global temperature targets in the Paris Agreement, and there's a desire in the global community to bring those temperatures back down. And so perhaps we go past 1.5 degrees, beyond 2, and there's this need to lower global average temperatures. Or it could be in light of what's known as common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. That's essentially shorthand for saying certain countries with the technical capacity and the legacy of historical emissions should reach net zero sooner and go net negative past that. And that's to allow perhaps other countries, typically developing countries, to decarbonize more gradually. So there's multiple roles across time. Now, the rest of this presentation is drawn from the publication Will mentioned earlier, published in December of last year. And here what we wanted to move from is that there's a number of global assessments around the economics, the potentials of different CDR methods. And what we wanted to shift towards is what government plans exist for CDR in the near decades ahead, and especially in this wider context of decarbonisation. How does CDR fit within the overall portfolio of national climate policies, for example? And so here we analyze around 41 long-term national climate strategies to really understand that. Now, long-term national climate strategies, this might not be a term you're familiar with. Officially, they're called longer-term low-emission development strategies, or LT-LEDs. And essentially what these represent is a government's attempt to model a pathway to the mid-century or beyond. And often those coincide with net zero targets. So essentially what's produced is a de facto net zero strategy. Now, these are formalized somewhat in the Paris Agreement under Article 4.19. But unlike the NDCs, these short-term pledges that define near-term climate ambition, there's no formal requirement for states to produce these. And so unlike the 194 as of today NDCs, only 57 have formally submitted LT-LEDs, although some, like the US, like the UK, are on their second iteration. So this is quickly becoming a norm within the sort of climate reporting that goes on at the national level. Now, when it comes to the 41 we analyzed, here's our timeline of what we examined. And what you'll notice quickly is that there's a lot of dark blue. These are the European member states. And essentially, it's important to note that our sample is somewhat biased towards Europe. That's not our bias necessarily. What's happening here is that the EU require these strategies to be produced as part of EU legislation. So for many member states in the European Union, these have both a role in the EuroCCC, in the international climate regime as their long-term strategy, but also a role in the EU as well. So it helps shape both international and EU policy. What you'll notice is missing is a lot of strategies from either Latin America or similarly Africa. And you'll also notice they're grouped towards the end. So there's been a real emphasis in the past few COPs on the Conference of Parties on submitting these strategies to the EuroCCC and then being publicized. But there were some first movers when this was agreed back in 2015. So for example, Mexico strategies from 2016. So quite a wide array of different timings, but nevertheless quite a recent sample. Now, when it came to our sort of examination of these strategies, we took all 41 And our first port of call was really to examine the modeling that happens in these strategies. So where a country puts forward a long-term pathway or a series of scenarios, we took those and examined what they assume in terms of different CDR and also in terms of residual emissions, essentially the balance of source and sinks when it comes to a net zero target. Now, to our surprise and perhaps concern, around half, about over 21, simply don't have the modeling, or they do modeling in too short term, essentially. So not out to the net zero target for the mid-century. And so from them, we really don't understand perhaps where CDR fits in to their climate agenda. Now, fortunately, 20 did. And out of that 20, about 13 primarily or solely rely on nature-based removals to compensate for their residual emissions, so to achieve that balance of source and sinks. Now, there's some interesting caveats to that 13. So Nepal and Fiji, for example, have quite a sizable forest carbon sink compared to their extent of residual emissions, so quite a favorable balance. And that perhaps allows for more leeway in terms of the eventual amount of residual emissions that's reached from implementing their strategy, or the potential to go net negative sooner. So quite a favorable balance there. Others, the extent of residual emissions and the extent of removals are more tightly coupled, so there's less room for error in implementing their strategies. Now, not all strategies follow a pattern of using forests and soils. There's some notably engineered strategies that come to play. You'll notice the UK, for example, is notably dependent on BECCS. Switzerland, in comparison, is notably dependent on DACs. And so it tends to be either forest-based strategies or nature-based strategies, or wholly engineered strategy, but those are few and far between. Now, what's interesting about CDR is that it's not only quantified in the model pathways presented, but also more widely discussed in terms of discussions on their feasibility, different proposed policies for forests and soils, etc., and also sectoral targets. So as sort of acknowledgement that model data only covers half our sample, we wanted to really track the textual mentions of CDR throughout the strategies as well. And this largely showed a continuation of the same story. You'll notice that forests and soils are by far the most advocated forms of CDR method in the strategies. 40 out of the 41 advocate for forests. Similarly, soil carbon is quite widely advocated at 30. But what's really noticeable is the contrasting forests and soils to BECCS and DACs. Not only are BECCS and DACs less in terms of how many strategies they feature, but they're also more speculative. So they tend to be caveated by certain statements surrounding breakthroughs in technology, breakthroughs in costs, for example, with DACs or energy requirements. So countries are interested in them, but they're not pursuing them necessarily in terms of policies until they see wider developments take place. So a hesitancy when it comes towards engineered CDR. But to us, what this really shows is that the idea of betting on forests and soils, the dominance of forests and soils in the wider discourse extends far beyond simply quantification. Now, when it comes to the feasibility discussions, we examine those and we really realize there's two main challenges to CDR governance that countries will see in the near term. And the first of which is the ability for forests and soils to act as particularly long-term and stable carbon sinks in the future. So there's some countries where the age of their forests or the way in which they're managed means that they don't necessarily expect substantial removals to take place in the decades to come. Or there's not enough area for additional forests, so there's very limited capacity they can add when it comes to removals. Now, some concern around natural hazards, particularly around wildfires, the risk of losing carbon from disease and pests. This is Portugal, for example, had quite large spread fires in 2017, which flipped the balance of its forest carbon from a sizable sink, to a substantial source. And there's real fear that might happen in the future and really jeopardize their transition to net zero. Similarly, when it comes to soils, there's a concern around land management. Perhaps we can there might be a change in the way the farmland is managed and the carbon is re-released back into the atmosphere. And also this concern around saturation, and that's simply that the amount of removals that happens in the soil could taper over time, so less is expected in the future. What I think is most overlooked and perhaps not commonly cited in the literature is the ability for countries to actually accurately estimate the amount of removals that happens in forests and soils. Put simply, countries haven't been very good at doing this in the past, and that uncertainty extends into their future in terms of their models, for example. You can quite easily imagine a situation where quite a certain amount of residual emissions, say from an industry source that's very well known, is compensated by a highly uncertain amount of forest removals, for example. And so that perhaps there's a sort of impact upon the country's ability to secure net zero. Now, when engineered CDR does not get away without concerns, there's a real concern around geological storage. Either a country doesn't have geological storage at all, or it's quite limited capacities. If you get past the storage question, there's often an issue with location or co-location. That's the source of your removal site and your eventual storage site. And similarly, if you get past all that, there's an extra concern of social acceptability. So should certain sites be prioritized? How does the social sort of context work in certain countries? Should offshore development be pursued first? And perhaps you're a country that has quite unfavorable circumstances with these. A lot look towards potential collaborations with other countries to allow removals to be transferred between entities. And particularly through what's known as Article 6 in the Paris Agreement, countries are circling in on should net zero be a more collaborative endeavor when it comes to engineered removals. Now, when it came to us reflecting upon these concerns and what was raised in the model pathways within these strategies, it really raised this tension within the net zero discourse. And what's clear to us is that the idea of betting on forests and soils is to be anticipated. There's this legacy of forest and land management. There's removals in forests has been part of the UNFCCC since around 1997. And similarly, there's a lot of policy mechanisms that support increased removals in forests. So REDD+, for example. There's the EU LULUCF regulation, for example, in the European Union. Now, what we don't want to portray is a sort of trade-off between engineered removals and the nature-based removals. Really, nature-based removals are essential and quite unique in the fact that they address multiple challenges at once. So we definitely need nature-based removals in terms of climate adaptation, and similarly in reversing biodiversity decline. Now, our concern is on the idea of wholly relying upon removals to do the task of residual emissions. And we're not alone in that concern. This looks to be quite clearly expressed through the strategies themselves. Now, it really comes down to what type of net zero do we want? Do we want net zero to be a state that's achieved and maintained, and perhaps as a transitional phase for many countries to a net negative state? If that's the case, then there needs to be, first and foremost, a real attention on sustained and deep and immediate emission reductions. This is the crucial caveat to all discussions around CDR, but also perhaps a re-engagement with the unique role of engineered removals, particularly things like BECCS and DACs. These can provide more assured removals in the long term and really be the basis of a net zero strategy. Nevertheless, we're quite uncomfortable with that conclusion. It poses a challenge to perhaps how strategies are produced currently. So we wanted to offer sort of a partial way forward. What we noticed is that LT-led long-term national climate strategies are a useful tool for national governments. They help governments think through the challenges of net zero. We also reflected that there's no real policy process necessarily, particularly at the international level, for countries to engage within CDR. CDR tends not to feature within NDCs, for example, or within the wider system of climate reporting supported by the UNFCCC. Only now is it beginning to filter through these long-term plans and therefore into certain policy agendas. So perhaps encouraging, first of all, the submission of LT-LEDs And then strengthening the requirements can be a positive step, especially when it comes to thinking through the needs of CDR. So simply put, the UNCCC can strengthen these through the COP process and produce formal guidance on particularly ideas around modeling, particularly ideas around residual emissions and the need for CDR. And there's some more of those strategies there. So there's Iceland's, the UK's, for example. These are quite large efforts by national governments, so it's important that they're supported at the international level. Now, just to close, I've got the paper on the left here. Perhaps I can put that in the chat for reference. We very much view our sort of field of CDR governance as a dialogue that's ongoing around some policy developments, and we're sort of happy to add our sort of piece to the conversation. But we'd love for you to read the paper and love for you to share your feedback with us as well. We really want to be sort of part of that ongoing conversation. And perhaps you're interested in understanding CDI governance a bit further. These are some of the papers we really enjoyed when we put together our own article. So there's a ready-made reading list for you if you're interested in the topic. And with that, I'll end there. Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Harry. And so we'll start the Q&A session, and I'll take my prerogative as a host to ask you an initial question here. So at one point in the piece, when you were talking about LT-LEDs, you indicated that in the future it would be important for countries to look more at social and cultural issues in designing those mechanisms. In the context of CDR specifically, what do you think some of the social and cultural factors they need to explore, countries need to explore more in the future?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think overly so the CDR discourse is quite dominated by questions of economics, sort of technical potentials and things like this. So increasingly, there's been calls for social science in particular to be more of a feature in the discourse. I think there's many sort of issues, and they tend to be more nationally led. So in particular in the UK, for example, there's a real focus on CDR being part of the wider government's agenda towards levelling up certain deprived areas. And so LT-LEDs, perhaps with a focus added on to the social context, can help bring those very specific challenges to the surface. I think one of my concerns with CDR in particular is the idea of social license. So put simply, a lot of particularly engineered removals rely on carbon capture and storage as a sort of feature of achieving negative emissions. And that's commonly a technology that has not only failed in the past in terms of its deployment and its expectations, but also in the views of many, sort of co-opted by largely fossil fuel interests to help sort of business plans. So there's this real risk that CDR, particularly with discussions around offsetting, could fall into the same sort of discourse. It very much depends on what is CDR compensating for in a national strategy. So is this compensating for higher fossil fuel use, or is this really tied down into very legitimate residual emissions around things we simply don't have the technology to address? So I think the questions of the social questions, and particularly the ethics, is only going to get stronger as countries look at CDR increasingly.
That's interesting, because it sounds like you expand the net of social license to operate maybe a bit further than some do, right? We often hear about this in the context of citing a specific facility in a community, right, and obtaining social license. But it seems like you're arguing that it includes a kind of a full-throated discussion of the actual role of CDR in overall national climate policymaking, right?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And there's some strategies, for example, that the level scenarios that they provide quite openly discuss the idea that improvements in removals could compensate for less industry pressure, essentially, less sort of pushback and potential problems with the fossil fuel sector. And so countries really do see this as perhaps a way to mediate between certain business interests. And so it's interesting to observe the tension. I think that tension will only grow. And particularly speaking from the UK, there tends to be quite key projects that happen that are more or less single site. So for example, in the UK, we have the Drax BECCS project, which is a power station in the north of England. And that's a single site, but it's probably going to provide most of the scale up of CDR in the near term in terms of the government strategy. And the government looks to, in the UK's case, in the UK net zero strategy, is to quite rapidly scale CDR. And yet its current strategy is quite highly weighted towards a single site. That's historically been quite controversial in certainly in the politics of the country. So this is part of the national strategy, but also ties down to the real deployment on singular sites as well.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that. Okay, let me get to some of the questions from our audience. First question, a PNAS study profiled in yesterday's Guardian is cast a shadow across afforestation efforts and carbon credits issued to date. This, they said, this is a volatile issue, and Verra, right, the certification organization, has challenged the reporting. But does it not call into question quite a lot of the CDR plans in NDCs?
Yes, yeah. I mean, that reporting is hugely interesting. It's actually based on a few recent papers, but also papers dating back to 2020, 2021. So it's long been part of concerns of scientists around offsetting that some, particularly what's known as avoided deforestation carbon credits, might not be as legitimate as certain suppliers suggest. In terms of NDCs, we have to consider is that there are certain the Verra, for example, are part of the voluntary carbon market, so are not formally part of things like NDCs, but there'll be a need for, particularly under Article 6, for removals that are transferred between countries, like, for example, in forests, to be accounted for in NDCs when they are actively traded. And so, although the offsetting market in VCM has been quite a long-standing issue that sits to the side of sort of the NDC process, there are concerns around, for example, if a country transfers removals from one forest to another, they need to make a corresponding adjustment, as termed, in the receiving party's NDC. And currently there's some guidance to exist in the UCCC that to guide that process, but it's very hard and very complicated by technical detail. So put simply, some countries have different capacities on what they can track in terms of their removals and what they can transfer, and therefore adjust in their own NDC tracking. So I think the problem of sort of forests could exacerbate the NDC process. Nevertheless, I think the VCM is its own issue, and something that certainly needs regulation around.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. Okay, next question. Where in the work being presented is a description of the analysis of sustainability, land use, and environmental impact of the technical options, as well as economic compensation?
Right. Yeah. So in terms of some of the engineered methods, they certainly require additional land use. So BECCS, for example, is commonly associated with either bioenergy crops or short rotation forestry. So they impinge upon the forestry sector or change the land cover of potentially a country if they're deployed more widely. There's been quite a heavy criticism on certain BECCS projects that require or at least currently source their biomass from abroad. So Drax, for example, in the UK, sources it from North America. And so there is already this growing trade of trading biomass between countries. From the climate policy perspective, there's concerns around, for example, if a number of countries in the global north looking towards BECCS deployment, then some of that biomass may well be sourced from the global south. And if so, what does the national emissions look like? Who gets credited with the removal emission, for example? And how is that adjusted for in the country that supplies the biomass? Nowhere in the strategies do we really see a full accounting of sort of sustainability or necessarily changes in land cover. But there are more general concerns expressed. So, for example, Switzerland have quite limited afforestation capacity, so they really turn towards direct air capture. But they also have quite limited geological storage, so they look particularly towards the North Sea and collaborations around the North Sea to deploy direct air capture abroad. So increasingly so, we'll probably see those sustainability concerns come to the fore. But nevertheless, I think the strategies represent only the top level thinking of perhaps the wider issues at play.
All right, thanks for that. This question is related to that, and you've adverted to some of the mechanisms, but maybe you'd want to expand on this. The question is, can you describe more how CDR can work across different countries, and what mechanisms would be used to establish these relationships and maintain them permanently?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a real live issue right now within CCC and featured quite heavily in COP27 as well. Essentially, this looks to be around Article 6. And Article 6 has two main mechanisms, the first of which is Article 6.2, which is a bilateral mechanism. So two countries could agree to trade what's known as internationally traded mitigation outcomes is the term. It's essentially carbon credits when it comes down to the terminology, but that could in theory be removals as well. And so a country can perhaps agree on to transfer the negative emissions from a direct air capture plant to another country, and that country that receives those removals would have to adjust their tracking towards the NDC accordingly. So that's one way, and on that basis, the governments in play can sort of direct some of the terms that transfer all happens, but there's still private guidance when it comes to the NDCs to formalize that. You can imagine you can't have multiple countries having different partnerships and then adjusting their NDCs in different ways. That wouldn't work. And so to sort of extend that and perhaps do that more efficiently, there's Article 6.4. And that's a unilateral mechanism, so anyone can participate. Essentially, this is the successor of the clean development mechanism in the Kyoto Protocol. So more or less a carbon credit market with a supervisory body that approves what removal projects, what other projects in mitigation are legitimate. And so in COP27, there was concerns on a proposal, particularly from civil society, that said removals can be as broad as can be in terms of IPCC terms. And perhaps those transfers should be tied down to specific forms of CDR, particularly the engineered methods, because they are more assured and because of the historical issues around forests, for example, sort of partly proven by the Vera case. And so this is very much still a politics at play. There's sort of critics who say, does this allow global north countries to sort of use their might to source credits from elsewhere? There's other countries like Australia that want to participate in those schemes or historically have to. The government's fortunately changed from when it originally published its strategy, but they're very keen to both be the producers of those credits or those mitigation outcomes and also the receiver. So they're very interested in perhaps improving the economics of reaching net zero by this extra liquidity that's supplied by Article 6.4. So there's many ways of doing it. It's very hard in practice, and we're unlikely to see a major market in 6.4, especially around removals, anytime soon.
Next question: what will be the effect of the carbon border adjustment mechanism, or carbon border adjustment mechanisms more generally, right? Because we're even talking about that here on CDR. Will it help with CDR expansion?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. Uh, I'm not up to date with the US debate. I'm afraid. I'm familiar with the EU one, where I think a carbon border adjustment has been agreed. Of course, in the case of removals, we're dealing with negative emissions. So historically, or conventionally, carbon border adjustments has been used to sort of prevent leakage, sort of penalize leakage of certain member states, and essentially improve standards in other countries in terms of imported goods. So to real sort of try and use the might of a single market to improve the standards elsewhere. I'm not really sure how that would play out in a border mechanism adjustment. More commonly, the EU looks towards its own emission trading. The EU ETS, for example, has proposals around perhaps including removal activities, although not yet. And if so, then the ETS has commonly been linked to outside markets as well. So perhaps that would be the way to include particularly removals in EU policy. But as I'm aware, there's no sort of considerations towards carbon border adjustments.
Okay, thanks. Do you see a danger in reliance on CDR as a performative policy, such as a nation could just report that they planted X amount of trees as a justification for them to continue X amount of emissions?
Yeah, this is again a fascinating question, one I think about all the time. It's a really top of my head sort of concern. There's this idea of mitigation deterrence. So does the potential for future CDR, or even the idea of CDR, change the policy plans and the extent of emission reductions in the near term? And but simply in terms of the strategies, potentially yes. There are pathways that include a higher amount of removals and less emission reductions as a result. Nevertheless, it's mitigation deterrence is sort of borne out in the policy plans, but the evidence as whether a country is serious about removals is the policies they put in place now. So this is our real concern around analysing long-term strategies, was that this is a concern that plays out in climate policy later in the century, but really needs to be enacted upon and sort of scaled in this decade. So it's hard to tell. There are lots of efforts amongst the EU, in the UK, and of course in the Biden administration. It's a live question, I think. Definitely in terms of the policy plans, there is that potential. Is it as widespread as some advocate? I'm not so sure.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating question. I mean, on one hand, you have people emphasizing, and I think the EU has done this to some degree, that we're supposed to wring out all of the possible emissions reductions, right, initially, and then think about CDR, right? But as you point out, if CDR is to be a viable part of the strategy, we have to be simultaneously developing those approaches, right? But if we're not sending market signals, right, that impel that, right, we may not get the level of CDR that we need down the road, or it may be more expensive, right? But balancing that against the threat of mitigation deterrence, right, is just a.
And if I may, I think it actually relates to the first question about Vera. I think Albert asked the question about the Guardian revelation about Vera, because what's really going on there is that companies have committed to net zero by 2030, which is feasibly very difficult. And so what you're having is, rather than focusing on emissions reductions, like actual decarbonisation, or feeling like there aren't many options there, that's where the offset is going to enable you to say you've achieved that target. So right. I think I recognize the layers of that, of this question about performative, but you can see it being mirrored in the kind of voluntary market with commercial entities, commercial organizations promising net zero, and then whether for some is a case of, oh, I can't do that yet in terms of the decarbonisation, we'll just buy the offsets, or whether it does mitigation deterrence, i.e. you go, oh, that feels a bit too hard, so we might be too much of a hit on our, you know, bottom line, so we will do the offset. So I think the mitigation deterrence is playing out almost faster. Some of these policy questions about nation state policy are playing out faster in the voluntary carbon market with commercial organizations. And I think, and also part of the problem, I think, with Verra and the amount of there's always been the challenge. Harry highlighted it in his analysis of the plans around uncertainties and methodologies. Again, it's come up in a couple of other questions, but it's this issue of additionality. Were those trees going to be deforested or not? So of course you say, yeah, of course they were, right? So this is over egging of what could have happened, and then this is what we've saved, and that's where the big gap is. I mean, it's pretty surprising the quantitative extent that they're finding in that study. You know, you kind of know it's there, but that scale of it. But I think it's motivated by there being a huge financial demand for these offset markets right now. Right. And there's not much that can deliver because DAX is only a couple of small pilot projects, and BECCS has, again, there's a number of questions just been going through the Q&A focusing on bioenergy and land use. So those concerns there about the antagonism between climate change and biodiversity goals around land use and land use change to deliver food fiber for society, but also potentially some bioenergy crop. And I think that that is why the BECCS hasn't got much traction as well, right? So you're here right now, people trying to say we can get to net zero in, or let me just check, 7 years. It's without doing the decarbonisation. So I think there's interesting links between the questions that are being raised in the chat. That's just what I wanted to draw together.
Thanks for that, Naeem. Okay, next question. Given the long-term plans you reviewed, do you make any estimate of the land area that would be required for or implied in the plans for using forests and soils for CDR at the scale that's contemplated?
Yeah, in short, no, and it's extremely hard to do so. I am aware of the land gap report, which was published in around COP27, which did provide sort of first order estimate. But it's very hard, typically because of the sourcing of biomass, for example, in certain projects, particularly around BECCS. LULUCF, or what's more commonly known as forests, LULUCF in the UNFCCC terminology, tends to be defined according to national extent. So in these strategies, countries are talking about their own forests, their own soils. So in that case, it's limited to the extent of overall countries, or at least their land cover extents. But the question of biomass and BECCS is a much harder one because of that trading.
I would just add to that, Will, if you see anybody do some really big numbers on biomass, they've taken the assumption that all of that biomass is coming from energy crop. And if they see some really bad numbers on that, they're assuming deforestation for it. Actually, to answer the question, it gets really messy and tied in with your projections of population growth, dietary change in assumptions, and therefore what rates in what parts of the world are abandonment or not. Your big assumption about food yield and how food yield will change. All of those three compete with each other to give you more or less abandoned agricultural land or available land to do some bioenergy crops. Again, sometimes you'll see the kind of estimates that look really big in terms of sustainability. Concerns around biomass will tend to assume fertilizer use, and yet second generation lignocellulosic biofuels that are being like miscanthus or switchgrass in the US don't have a fertilizer need, and they tend to do well on no irrigation. And so there's huge uncertainty range on that, and that's what you'll see at the lower end in terms of the estimates and the land footprint. You'll see bound up in that assumptions about dietary shift away from meat and dairy. In certain parts of the world, you'll see assumptions about improved yield over time. You will see assumptions about the use of municipal solid waste, streams of biomass, in construction streams of biomass, but also notably forestry residues or other agricultural residues. And so that's the two ends of those numbers. They are the reasons why they're differing. It's also very hard to land at a solid answer on that discussion.
Yeah, and And I thought that was a good granular rendition of the issues, and far more granular, quite frankly, than what's in the LT LEDs, right? Which is kind of one of your points, and really, in my opinion, going to have to be done with some integrity moving forward. So, but it's a huge challenge. Next question. It seems reliance on sinks has first been seen as a more convenient way to reach net zero compared to more drastic emissions reductions, but the more recent increase in natural disturbances impacting many ecosystems enhanced by climate change, things like droughts and fires, did any of the few updates of long-term strategies take into account these kind of things, such as focusing more on other tools?
Yeah, that's a really important question, and sort of one of our concerns that we sort of try to express in the paper is that a lot of countries are mirroring some of the latest science in terms of saying the extent of forest fires will increase in the future, according to our current trajectories, and similarly, there are quite widespread infestations of disease and pests that are exacerbated by climate change. And similarly with droughts and such around impacting potential growth. So the projections in terms of the carbon sinks, or particularly forests, are quite limited. They tend to take quite simple variables. Some countries even keep their overall sink static across their projections. And some of those are improvement in more recent strategies, but essentially it means countries are struggling to really estimate what their forests look like in the future. What they more readily draw upon is their historical experience. So countries that have had quite widespread wildfires express concerns about being able to do that in the future. But they also perhaps also express in the same instance concerns around, can they look towards engineered methods? These are methods that are very small at the current scales, and the challenge of scaling them is enormous. So it seems countries are stuck between a rock and a hard place, or their forests and their geological storage. There's no easy answers in terms of the strategies, and that's increasingly what countries are learning. And that's why we're so keen on them in terms of strengthening them, because it forces countries into very pragmatic levels of thinking, and moves away from perhaps the pledge and forget or mode of particularly corporate climate governance.
Great. All right. Next question. Does biochar bio-oil offer a more permanent alternative to forests, or do you consider this an engineered CDR?
Yes. So I'm aware of, for example, Charm Industrial, which is a company in the US that does this technique on scale, and typically, particularly in the sort of private CDR market, the market of removals that's applied to sort of corporate purchases, etc. They are one of the larger players, and that's perhaps surprised the market analysts in terms of they were looking at direct air capture, but actually on the scales of their removals, the bio oils are more successful. When it comes to the national scale, countries are looking at balancing the many different ways they can use biomass, and so biomass is perhaps a way of producing biofuels and decarbonizing certain transports. It impacts upon land cover, so the way in which they currently can manage their short rotation forestry, for example, or they use in BECCS. And so they tend to try and look at, they don't feature bio-oils in particular. Some feature biochar. There's our supplementary methods where you can find biochar references, for example. Biochar is quite few and far between. Bio-oil, in our opinion, would probably be an engineered method. But nevertheless, from the national level, it's more holistic. People think, well, countries tend to think of biomass a bit more like hydrogen in terms of it's a tool to decarbonize multiple sectors, and something that needs to be balanced in this sort of holistic strategy. So the UK, for example, is yet to publish its biomass strategy, which sort of pulls the threads of biomass use in the UK together across these different uses. And I think it's quite a challenge to do so.
Yeah, so it sounds like a really important thing to do fairly quickly, given, as you indicated at the outset, the real reliance on biomass in terms of the UK CDR strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. It's I think it's slightly late according to the timetable, so I think hopefully it's forthcoming. But you can see Germany, for example, have also released a carbon management strategy. So what we often see as a follow-up to these more sort of larger efforts around LT-LEDs and long-term strategies is a series of smaller publications around perhaps what you call tools for decarbonisation, hydrogen strategies, for example, biomass strategies, and also carbon management in terms of carbon utilisation, the storage elements. So you can see this as a prompt to wider thinking and more detailed thinking by national governments as well. So that's why we're also keen on them in terms of this helps bring about some more national policy.
Okay. All right, next question. For the analysis of residual emissions in the LT-LEDs, is the source of the data the LT-LEDs documents themselves, or did you refer to further national sources to obtain the data?
Yes, so that's the data from the LT-LEDs themselves, the strategies. So simultaneously to projecting their CDR, they also project their leftover emissions, the residual emissions. We're sort of working through an analysis right now what those emissions represent. And what's quite interesting is that in the scientific literature, there's quite a good agreement on what are residual emissions. They tend to be certain industries that require high temperature heat, for example. Certainly fertilizer emissions tend to be quite a sort of unanimously agreed difficult to decarbonize emission. But when you transfer that to the national context, it interacts with national priorities. Governments want to preserve certain sectors, for example. And so there's differences and also challenges that are unique to certain countries that apply to different sectors. So you don't see the same patterns in literature that you do with residual emissions from countries. So for example, Australia's residual emissions tend to be towards its oil and gas extraction sector, which in other countries is completely decarbonized by renewables. That's because Australia, particularly in that iteration of the strategy, which is due to be replaced by the incoming government, wanted to preserve that position in its sort of economic circumstance as an exporter of certain fossil fuels. So residual emissions is quite a fluid concept. I think the attention on residual emissions will only increase in the future. And it's also an area, because it is the legitimacy of using CDR in the strategy, it also helps sort of, it could be captured by certain sort of interests as well. So residual emissions from the strategies themselves, but quite varied in actually what they represent.
And can I just shout out, because I'm particularly proud of the work that Harry did on this, so to Fiona on that question, if you go to the paper, it's all open access and supplementary methods. You can find all the detail and exactly source back within each document where Harry got those numbers and those values from. So it's fully traceable, which represents a really good piece of work. So if you want to go and use that data, that's in the supplementary methods of the paper.
Okay. All right, we moved from land to the oceans. There's a question, what about ocean-based CDR? And there's some specific questions associated with that. Who should get credit for it? How's it managed?
Yes, yeah, excellent question. I mean, in the scientific literature, ocean CDR is really quite a hot topic right now. In the LT-LEDs, we don't really see ocean-based CDR mentioned. The US, in fact, is the only one that sort of mentions a need for further research in ocean-based CDR. This is different from blue carbon, which tends to be coastal habitats, so things like seagrass meadows, mangroves, etc. This is open ocean stuff, essentially, or more coastal waters further from the coast itself. Of course, once you get into international waters, there's limited sort of ownership jurisdictions. Who owns the open waters is not constrained to CDR, but it's all sorts of international laws and shipping in general. So I think it's an ongoing governance debate, whether we'll see that in time. I think the real question when it comes to CDR is probably more based towards forest, direct air capture and BECCS, rather than ocean-based CDR, but nevertheless, I would happily change my mind if we see some good research.
Just to add to that, as someone who's written a bit on this ocean stuff, is that if you think additionality and what we just talked about with the forests and Vera, like were they going to be decarbonised or not, and the monitoring and reporting and the methodology uncertainty on land is hard, up it when it's in 3D and moving and no one owns it, right? So you have International Maritime Organization in terms of governance, but critically you've got a 3D moving interconnected problem that's hard to sample. And so your monitoring, your verification and your predictability of the system, but particularly your additionality, showing that what you've done is additional and has not just actually removed nutrients from something else. So you've grown seaweed, but have you just meant that there's less phytoplankton growing because what you've used is the nitrate and the phosphate. So oceans are actually quite limited by their nitrate and phosphate availability. And so it can look good on a first pass, but if you really dig deep with some biogeochemists, it often doesn't play out fully. And so that is a sticking point on a lot of the ocean-based CDR, Peter.
Okay. We are almost at time, so I guess I'll call on you for any closing thoughts that you might have in terms of this topic. Maybe any future research agenda that might grow out of this, for example.
Yeah, I think for us, looking at these long-term strategies was really enlightening, but also humbling in terms of we realized the full challenge of reaching net zero for a lot of countries, and also the current state of sort of government thinking around CDR.
Mm-hmm.
We are sort of made more cheerful by the State of CDR report that was released only today, which pointed to a bit more developments around government thinking. Indeed, there's this need to track both NDCs and LT-LEDs, but also the everyday policy making that happens in the near term. And I think what we also want to do and achieve with this paper is just bring LT-LEDs to wider attention. We often hear about the NDCs. You hear of international assessments that essentially total up the NDCs and determine what pathways we're on. And actually what we learned is that the LT-LEDs flesh out a lot more detail in the long term, actually tie down those projections to more realistic trajectories and actually really tell us where we're going in an international sense. So look at LT-LEDs, they're on the UCCC website, they're a really important resource. And also, please, go to our paper and search through and we'd love to know your thoughts.
Great. And could you give a little more flesh about the report released today, the CDR report? I think that's something that would be of interest to people also. Yeah,
absolutely. And so what's interesting about that report is it's a State of CDR report released by University of Oxford and a range of other partners that are involved in CDR research. We're not affiliated with that group, but we're sort of aware of them. And it's essentially the first major publication in CDR. Think of this as kind of like the IPCC of CDR, trying to track where we are with the current sort of level deployment. And what that really showed is that they tried to produce the first estimate of removals at the international level. And essentially all of that is forests. So it really sort of confirms some of our thinking in this paper that forest and soils is the dominant agenda right now, both currently, but also what our paper shows is in the future as well. And so what that report concluded with is a real need and urgency to scale up what they call novel CDR, what we call engineered methods in our paper. So it's time to step on the gas when it comes to things like direct air capture, but to do so responsibly, and that can only be premised in the near term by quite large and steep emission reductions. So emission reductions should be probably on the top of the anyone's CDR agenda.
Great. Okay, we have reached the bewitching hour, so I'd like to once again thank Harry and Naomi for joining us and for our audience today and the excellent questions. We'll be back in a couple of weeks, and I hope you'll join us again, and have a great rest of the day to everyone. Bye now.
Thank you.